I arrived at Frontier Research Station Epsilon-12 after a 6-month voyage through the expanse of space. The station appeared in the distance, a haphazard conglomeration of metal and lights orbiting a distant planet. The docking procedure was smooth, the monotony of routine providing a brief respite from the constant low-level dread that had accompanied me since I first read the mission brief. The airlock opened, and I was greeted by Dr. Megan Brooks, the station's chief scientist. Her eyes seemed empty, the bags under them dark, reflecting months of sleepless nights and stress. She gave a curt nod and a forced smile. "Welcome, Dr. Harper. I hope your trip was uneventful." "It was," I replied, looking forward to getting started. We walked through the corridors. The walls were adorned with hastily scrawled notes and reminders, the detritus of frantic minds at work. Brooks gave me a brief tour, pointing out the various labs, living quarters, and the mess hall. In the mess hall, a few crew members were eating their rations in silence. Dr. Anders, the physicist, gave a brief wave. His gaunt face and bloodshot eyes spoke volumes about the station's atmosphere. Next to him, Dr. Lee, the biochemist, was slumped over a tablet, furiously typing away. Neither seemed particularly interested in the newcomer. "That's Anders and Lee," Brooks said. "They've been here since the beginning. You'll be working closely with them." I nodded, taking in the sparse, utilitarian surroundings. The mess hall was a stark stainless steel room, with a few tables and chairs bolted to the floor. Brooks led me to my quarters, a small room barely larger than a closet. No windows, of course. I dropped my bag on the bed and glanced around. "Not much, but it's home," Brooks said. "Get settled in. We have a briefing at 8. She left me to unpack. I sat on the edge of the bed, the reality of my new surroundings sinking in. This place was a far cry from the bustling labs and bright offices I was used to. I began to unpack, methodically placing my clothes in the locker and setting up my personal items on the desk. 8 o'clock came quickly. The briefing room was small, with a single table surrounded by chairs. Brooks, Anders, and Lee were already there, along with Dr. Felix, the station's engineer. He sipped a cup of what passed for coffee here. "We're glad you're here, Harper," Brooks began, her tone all business. "We've made significant progress, but we're also facing unprecedented challenges." She launched into a detailed explanation of the ongoing experiments with dark matter. They were attempting to harness and manipulate it, pushing the boundaries of known physics. The potential applications were staggering, but so were the risks. Equipment failures, unexpected reactions, and the ever-present threat of containment breaches. As Brooks spoke, I glanced around the table. Anders was focused, his eyes darting between the screen and his notes. Lee seemed distracted, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the table. Felix was barely holding it together, his exhaustion obvious. "And that's where you come in, Harper," Brooks said, snapping me back to attention. "Your expertise in particle physics is crucial. We've hit a wall, and we need fresh eyes." "I'll do what I can," I replied, "but I need to understand the full scope of the project." "You'll get up to speed quickly," Anders interjected. "It's not the theories that are the problem. It's the execution. Its actions are completely unfamiliar to us." "Understood," I said. "Let's get to work." The meeting adjourned, and I spent the rest of the day familiarizing myself with the station's systems and protocols. The labs were cluttered with equipment, some of it cobbled together from salvaged parts. As the hours passed, I began to understand the task ahead. This was no ordinary research station. The isolation, the constant danger, the toll on the crew, it all painted a grim picture. Yet there was no turning back. We were on the frontier of science, pushing the limits of human knowledge. The next morning started early. The artificial lights came on at 6, accompanied by the grating beep of the station's alarm. I dragged myself out of bed, feeling the fatigue of restless sleep weigh down my limbs. After a quick breakfast, I made my way to Lab 3, where today's experiment was set to take place. It was the largest lab on the station, a cluttered space filled with machinery, computer terminals, and dark matter containment units. Dr. Brooks was already there, overseeing the final preparations. Anders and Lee were huddled around a console, deep in discussion. Felix was tweaking the cooling systems. "Morning, Harper." Brooks greeted me without looking up from her datapad. "We're just about ready to start. How are you feeling?" "Ready?" I replied, though the truth was far more complex. My nerves were on edge because of the sheer size of the project. "Good. We need everyone at their best," Brooks said, finally glancing up. "Today's experiment is critical. We're going to attempt to create a stable, dark matter field. If we succeed, it could open up a whole new realm of possibilities. And if we fail, we won't," she said, her voice firm but not entirely convincing. "Let's get to it." I joined Anders and Lee at the main console. The screen displayed a dizzying array of data. Energy levels, magnetic field strengths, particle velocities. It was a complex ballet of physics and engineering, each element needing to align perfectly to avoid catastrophic failure. "Everything's set," Anders said. "Field generators are primed. Containment units are online. Just waiting on your go, Dr. Brooks." Brooks took a deep breath and gave a sharp nod. "Begin the sequence." I watched as Anders initiated the experiment. The noise from the machines increased, shaking the room. The lights dimmed slightly as power was diverted to the containment units. "Energy levels stabilizing," Lee reported, her eyes glued to the screen. "Field generators at full power." "Containment units holding steady," Felix added from his station. "No fluctuations." For a moment it seemed like everything was going smoothly. The data flowed across the screen in a steady stream, the numbers within expected parameters. Then, a warning light flashed. "Energy spike in Generator 3, Anders called out, attempting to compensate. The room tensed. I could feel the fear and concentration radiating from the team. The noise from the machines increased, and it began to rumble. "Field destabilizing," Lee said, her voice rising. "We need to shut it down." "Not yet," Brooks snapped. "Hold it together, we can stabilize." The rumble turned into a roar. The lights dimmed and a series of loud clunks echoed through the lab as the containment units struggled to maintain their integrity. I could feel the floor vibrating beneath my feet. "Containment is failing," Felix said. "We need to abort." "Harper, help me with the manual override," Anders yelled, already moving towards the control panel. I rushed to his side, our hands moving over the switches and dials. Anders and I threw the final switch. The roar of the machinery wound down to a sullen hum. The lights stabilized. For a moment, there was silence. Then a high-pitched whine filled the air. The central containment unit, a massive, reinforced cylinder, began to glow. The metal warped and twisted, and a black void started to form at its center. The anomaly expanded, a swirling vortex of darkness and energy. Equipment was sucked into it, disappearing into the void. The air felt like it was being pulled from my lungs, the pressure intense. I grabbed onto the nearest console, trying to anchor myself. Out of the vortex, something emerged. At first it was just a shadow, an indistinct shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. Then it solidified into something impossible to describe. It was a shapeless blob of blackness, with streaks of absolute darkness shooting out everywhere. Felix and Anders scrambled to activate the emergency protocols. Heavy doors began to slide shut, cutting off the lab from the rest of the station. I watched in horror as one of the tendrils snaked out and wrapped around Lee's leg. She was yanked off her feet, screaming as she was dragged toward the anomaly. Anders and I grabbed her arms, pulling with all our strength. The tendril tightened, and I could feel Lee's bones crack under the pressure. Her screams turned into gurgles as the tendril wrapped around her throat. With a horrible snap, Lee was pulled into the vortex, her body disappearing into the void. Felix managed to activate the final lock. The doors slammed shut, the seals engaging. The anomaly was cut off, the entity trapped inside the lab. The noise died down, leaving only the heavy breathing of the survivors. I collapsed against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Lee was gone, consumed by the darkness. The anomaly had opened, and something had come through. Brooks took charge immediately. "We need a full lockdown. Felix, initiate quarantine protocols. Anders, Harper, let's secure the lab and assess the damage." Felix nodded and moved to the control panel. The rest of us began the grim task of securing the lab. Broken equipment and rubble littered the floor, some pieces still sparking from electrical shorts. The containment units were a mangled mess of metal and glass, their delicate instruments now useless. "We have to make sure that thing doesn't get out," Brooks said, her voice tight with stress. Anders and I worked setting up temporary barriers and sealing off any breaches. As I moved a piece of twisted metal, I couldn't stop thinking about Lee being pulled into the void. The tendrils, the crushing force, the utter helplessness. It was a scene that would haunt me forever. Once the lab was as secure as we could make it, we regrouped at the main console. Felix had activated the quarantine protocols, sealing off the entire section of the station. Heavy blast doors were now the only barrier between us and the rest of Epsilon-12. "Report," Brooks demanded, her eyes scanning the screen. "Quarantine is active," Felix said, his voice steadier now. "The entity is contained within this lab section. I've locked down all access points." "Good," Brooks replied. "Now we need to figure out what went wrong." Anders pulled up the data logs from the experiment. It started with a spike in the energy levels of Generator 3. It triggered a cascade failure in the containment fields. "We pushed the limits too far," Brooks muttered. "We underestimated the instability of dark matter." "We need to understand this entity," I said, feeling a chill as I spoke. "What is it? Where did it come from?" "One step at a time," Brooks replied. "First, we need to ensure it can't break through our containment. Then we can analyze the data and try to make sense of it." We spent the next few hours reinforcing the barriers and monitoring the entity. It stayed within the sealed lab, its dark tendrils occasionally lashing out but unable to breach the reinforced walls. The creature seemed to be probing its new environment, testing for weaknesses. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion set in. We took shifts, two monitoring the entity while the others rested. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lee's face twisted in terror. I could hear her bones cracking, her screams cut short. During my shift with Anders, we observed the entity through the lab's security cameras. It was a mass of shifting darkness, constantly changing shape. Tendrils of dark matter flowed like liquid, sometimes forming what seemed like rudimentary limbs or eyes, only to dissolve back into the blackness. "What do you make of it?" I asked Anders. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's not just dark matter. It has some form of intelligence or instinct. It reacts to its environment. Do you think it came through the rift, or did we create it somehow?" The question felt absurd even as I asked it. Anders shook his head. "I think it came through. We opened a door to somewhere else. And this thing walked in." "Harper, Anders," Brooks's voice came over the intercom, pulling us from our grim reflections. "Get some rest. Felix and I will take the next shift." Reluctantly, we left the console and headed to the crew quarters. The station's corridors were eerily silent, the usual activity replaced by a heavy stillness. As I lay down on my bunk, the events of the day played over and over in my mind. The rift, the entity, Lee's death. The fear and confusion were almost overwhelming. The next morning, the bleak reality of our situation had not changed. Brooks called another meeting in the briefing room. Her face looked thin and worn, the strain evident in her eyes. "We need to figure out a way to neutralize this entity," she began without preamble. "Our containment is holding, but we can't keep it in there forever. We need answers, and we need them fast." Have we made any progress analyzing the data? I asked, my voice rough from lack of sleep. Some, Felix said, rubbing his temples. The energy signature from the rift doesn't match any known sources. It's not just dark matter. There's something else at play here. Some form of exotic energy. Could we replicate it? Anders asked. Create another rift to send it back? Possibly, Brooks said, but it's incredibly risky. We barely survived the first attempt. We need more information before we can even consider that. Then we study the entity, I said. Learn everything we can about it. Its behavior, its weaknesses. There has to be something we can use. Brooks nodded. Agreed. We'll need to set up a dedicated observation team. Harper, Anders. That's your priority. Felix and I will continue working on the data and containment strategies. We spent the rest of the day setting up observation equipment and running tests on the entity. It reacted to different stimuli, sometimes violently, sometimes with apparent curiosity. The more we observed, the more it became clear that this was no mindless creature. It had purpose and intent, though what those were we could only guess. The routine we had established was a fragile semblance of normalcy. Each day, we monitored the entity, recorded its movements, and analyzed the data from the experiment. Our communications with the outside world had been cut off as part of the quarantine, leaving us truly isolated. It was during one of these endless days that things took a turn for the worse. I was in the observation room with Anders, reviewing the latest footage of the entity. It was behaving erratically, its dark tendrils thrashing against the reinforced walls of the containment unit. Felix was in the control room, running diagnostics on the station's systems, while Brooks was reviewing the energy readings from the experiment. It's reacting to something, but I can't figure out what. Anders muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. Maybe it's sensing something we're not picking up, I suggested. Some form of energy or signal. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the station, followed by the sound of tearing metal. My heart leapt into my throat. Anders and I exchanged a panicked glance before bolting out of the observation room. We met Felix in the corridor. What the hell was that? He asked. I don't know, I replied, but it came from the containment area. We raced through the corridors. When we reached the containment area, we found Brooks standing in front of the control panel, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. The entity breached containment, she said. It tore through the reinforced walls like they were paper. I stared at the gaping hole in the containment unit. The metal was warped, the edges glowing with residual heat. The entity was gone, leaving only traces of dark matter clinging to the ruins. Where is it now? I asked, my mouth dry. Brooks pointed to the security monitor. The screen showed the entity moving through the station, its dark tendrils extending and retracting as it navigated the corridors. It seemed to be searching for something. We need to track it, Brooks said, and try to contain it again. Felix, can you reroute power to the secondary containment units? I'm on it, Felix replied. Harper, Anders, Brooks continued. We need to figure out a way to slow it down. If we can trap it in one of the unoccupied sections, we might have a chance. We grabbed the closest weapons we had. Plasma cutters, sonic stunners, and a few old-model pulse rifles that had seen better days. We found the entity in one of the storage rooms, its tendrils rummaging through the equipment. It seemed almost curious, exploring its new environment. But as soon as it noticed us, its demeanor changed. The tendrils stiffened, and it turned toward us. Back away slowly, Brooks whispered. Don't provoke it. We began to retreat, but one of the tendrils shot out, wrapping around a metal crate and hurling it across the room. The crate crashed into the wall, narrowly missing Anders. The entity advanced, its tendrils reaching out for us. We sprinted down the corridor, the entity in pursuit. The station's passageways became a maze, the walls amplifying the sound of our panicked breaths and pounding footsteps. We reached a junction and split up, hoping to confuse the creature. I found myself in the engineering section. I could hear the entity behind me, its tendrils scraping against the walls. I ducked into a maintenance shaft. The darkness was complete, the only sound my breathing. Minutes passed before the sound of the entity faded. I cautiously emerged from the shaft, my body trembling with adrenaline. I needed to find the others, regroup, and figure out our next move. I made my way back to the main control room, where I found Felix working at the console. Brooks and Anders arrived shortly after. Their faces were drained of color and looked thin. "We managed to divert it to the lower levels," Anders said, catching his breath. "But it won't stay there for long." "We need to set up a trap," Brooks said. "Felix, can you rig the doors to seal off the lower levels completely?" "It'll take some time," Felix replied. "But I think I can do it." "Good," Brooks said. "Harper, Anders, gather any equipment that can help us reinforce the doors. We can't let it reach the upper levels." We spent the next few hours fortifying the lower levels, setting up barriers and reinforcing the doors with whatever we could find. When the fortifications were complete, we returned to the control room. The entity was still in the lower levels, moving slowly and methodically. The station had settled into a tense routine, but there was no peace to be found. Each of us was on edge, every sound and shadow feeding our growing paranoia. We knew the entity was somewhere in the lower levels, and it was only a matter of time before it found a way back up. It was during one of my monitoring shifts that the situation took a dire turn. The cameras we had set up in the containment area began to malfunction, the feed distorting. I leaned in, trying to make sense of the scrambled images. "Something's happening," I muttered. Brooks and Anders joined me, their expressions grim. The screen showed the entity, a swirling mass of dark matter, beginning to shift. It stretched and twisted, forming shapes that were almost human but horribly distorted. Limbs sprouted and dissolved, eyes formed and vanished, and a mouth-like opening appeared. It made a humming sound that gave me chills. "It's changing," Brooks whispered. As we watched, one of the dark tendrils extended towards the camera. The screen went black, and a moment later we heard the unmistakable sound of tearing metal coming from the corridors. "It's breached containment again," Anders said, his voice barely controlled. "We armed ourselves with plasma cutters and sonic stunners, the best tools we had for defending against something we didn't understand. We found it in the maintenance bay. It had taken on a more defined form, standing on two legs but with arms that extended into numerous tendrils. The dark matter that composed it seemed to absorb the light, creating an eerie, shifting silhouette. "Back away slowly," Brooks instructed, her voice steady despite the fear I saw in her eyes. We moved cautiously, but the entity reacted quickly. One of its tendrils lashed out, wrapping around a nearby tool cart and hurling it across the room. I ducked just in time, the cart smashing into the wall behind me. We scattered, trying to avoid the creature's reach. I fired my sonic stunner, the high-frequency waves causing the entity to recoil momentarily. It let out a sound, a deep, resonant vibration. Anders was less fortunate. A tendril caught his leg, pulling him off his feet. He screamed as the dark matter enveloped his limb, the pressure causing the bones to snap. I rushed to help, firing my stunner again and again, but the entity's grip was incredibly strong. Brooks and Felix joined in, their plasma cutters slicing through the air, creating bursts of intense light and heat. The entity pulled away again, its form shifting and destabilizing. Anders managed to crawl away, his leg mangled and bleeding. We retreated, dragging Anders with us. The entity did not pursue, but its presence loomed, the threat ever present. We barricaded ourselves in the control room, the sound of our breathing filling the space. Arguments erupted almost immediately. Felix and Anders wanted to abandon the station to try and escape in the emergency shuttle. Brooks insisted that we had to find a way to neutralize the entity, to prevent it from escaping into the wider universe. The tension boiled over, voices raised, accusations flying. I watched the arguments unfold, feeling the strain of our situation deepen the divides between us. The fear and stress were breaking us apart, turning us against each other. My thoughts drifted back to Lee. Losing her made it clear how vulnerable we are. The entity had taken her, and now it was taking us piece by piece, breaking us down. We spent the next hours devising a strategy. Brooks suggested using the station's power systems to create a containment field strong enough to hold the entity. Felix and I worked on reconfiguring the power grid, rerouting energy to the lower levels where we hoped to trap the creature again. I sat at the console, watching the monitors. The fractures within our group were growing. Each argument, each failure to communicate weakened us further. We were becoming more isolated, distrustful, and desperate. The entity thrived on our fear, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it struck again. The next day brought a new horror. Strange black growths began to appear on the walls and floors of the lower levels. The growths were an extension of the entity, consuming any inorganic material they touched. The metal walls corroded, the floors warped, and the lights dimmed as the growths crept further into the station. "Harper, look at this," Brooks said, pointing to one of the monitors. The screen showed the black limbs spreading through the maintenance bay, twisting and branching out like some parasitic vine. As if the situation weren't dire enough, a lullaby began to play intermittently over the station's intercom system. The melody was soft and eerie, a child's tune that echoed through the empty halls, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Where's that coming from?" Anders asked. "No one is broadcasting it," Felix replied, checking the system logs. "The intercom is not being manually operated." The lullaby had an immediate and disturbing effect. Those who heard it felt an inexplicable compulsion to follow the sound. It was as if the melody bypassed all rational thought, reaching deep into the subconscious and pulling at some primal part of the mind. We monitored the cameras, watching in horror as other workers on the station, those not part of our immediate group, began to succumb to the lullaby's call. They moved through the corridors in a trance, their eyes glazed. They walked toward the lower levels. "There goes Mitchell," Felix said quietly, pointing to one of the screens. Mitchell, a technician, was shambling down the hall, his face blank. He disappeared into the darkness of the lower levels, the black limbs reaching out to him as he approached. Another screen showed 3 more workers, their faces vacant, following the same path. We watched helplessly as they were enveloped by the dark growths, their bodies consumed and absorbed into the entity's expanding mass. "This is madness," Anders said, his voice trembling. "We can't just sit here and watch them die." "If we try to rescue them, we'll be next," Brooks insisted. The image of the workers was seared into my memory. Their lifeless eyes, their slow march to their deaths. The entity wasn't just a physical threat. It was a psychological weapon, breaking us down bit by bit. As if the black growths, the haunting lullaby, and the pursuit weren't enough, the entity found a new way to torment us. It started with Lee. The cameras in the lower levels, though obscured by the dark growths, showed movement. At first, we thought it was more workers lured by the lullaby, but then the feed cleared just enough for us to see her. Lee's body, twisted and corrupted by the dark matter, moved in a spasmodic fashion through the corridor. Her eyes were empty, and her skin was mottled with the same black substance that coated the walls. The entity had reanimated her, using her like a puppet. "Is that—" Felix trailed off, his face pale as he stared at the screen. "Lee," Brooks confirmed, her voice a whisper. "It's using her." Lee's reanimated form was on a mission, heading directly for one of the barricades we had set up to contain the entity. "Why is it doing this?" Anders asked. "Why use her like this?" "To break us?" I replied, a cold realization settling in. "It knows we're watching. It's using them to get to us." We watched in horrified silence as Lee reached the barricade. Her hands, still mottled with dark matter, fumbled with the locks and barriers. The entity's control over her was precise, each movement calculated to undo our efforts. Piece by piece, the barricade was dismantled. Before any of us could react, the screen flashed, and Lee's face filled the monitor. Her eyes, once full of life, were now voids of darkness. Her mouth moved, and a voice that was both hers and not hers spoke. "Why do you fight?" The entity's voice rasped through her. "You cannot win." The sound of Lee's voice, twisted and corrupted, sent a shiver down my spine. It was a taunt, a cruel reminder of our helplessness. The entity was using our fallen comrades against us, turning them into tools of psychological warfare. The screen flashed again, showing another corridor. This time it was Mitchell, his body similarly reanimated and corrupted by the dark matter. He moved towards another barricade, his hands working methodically to dismantle it. The cameras switched again, this time to a group of reanimated workers. Their movements were a macabre dance of death, their bodies controlled by the entity. They worked together, dismantling our defenses. As we watched, the intercom came to life. The same haunting lullaby began to play, but this time it was interspersed with the voices of our lost colleagues. They spoke in unison, their voices mocking. "Join us!" they chanted. "There is no escape. There is no hope." The psychological toll was immediate. Felix slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. Anders paced back and forth, muttering to himself. Brooke stared at the screen, her eyes filled with despair. We were trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. Our fallen comrades turned against us. The entity's power was growing, and our chances of survival were slipping away. The decision came swiftly. The entity's assault had left us no choice. We gathered in the control room, the monitors showing the reanimated corpses dismantling the last of our barricades. "We can't let this thing escape," Brooks said. "If it gets out, it could spread, infecting everything it touches. We have to destroy the station." Felix looked up from his console. "What about the emergency shuttle? We could escape and remotely destroy the station." Brooks shook her head. "The risk is too high. We could be contaminated. If even one of us is carrying a trace of the entity, it would be a disaster. We have to make sure it ends here." Silence fell over the room. We were committing ourselves to a suicide mission, ensuring that the entity would be destroyed at the cost of our own lives. We moved quickly, each of us with a task to complete. Felix began the process of initiating the self-destruct sequence, typing the necessary commands. Brooks and I worked on sealing the remaining sections of the station, ensuring that the entity and its puppets couldn't interfere. The self-destruct sequence required manual activation from multiple locations around the station, ensuring that it couldn't be accidentally triggered. Felix finished his part, turning to us with a nod. "It's ready. We need to activate the final sequence from the reactor core." We made our way through the dark corridors and reached the reactor core, the heart of the station. "Are you sure about this?" Anders asked. Brooks placed a hand on his shoulder. "We have to be certain that the entity is destroyed." We each took our positions around the reactor, hands poised over the final activation switches. The entity's voice filled the room, a final attempt to break our resolve. I looked at my colleagues, seeing the fear in their eyes. We had come this far, and there was no turning back. We activated the switches simultaneously, the reactor humming to life as the countdown began. 10 minutes to destruction. The entity's puppets grew frantic. On the monitors we saw them trying to reach us, but the barriers held, giving us precious minutes to say our goodbyes. Felix stood by the console, his face set with grim determination. "It's been an honor," he said, his voice cracking. Brooks nodded, tears in her eyes. "We'll make sure it ends here." As the countdown continued, the entity's taunts grew more desperate. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal." With each passing second, the reality of our situation became more acute. The entity's final gambit was psychological, trying to break our resolve in the last moments. But we stood firm. united in our purpose. The final minute ticked away. We gathered together, a small circle in the heart of the station, facing our end with a grim resolve. The entity's voice faded, replaced by the hum of the reactor reaching critical mass. 10 seconds, Felix said. We held hands, a final gesture of unity. The countdown reached 0, and the reactor core exploded in a blinding flash of light and heat. The explosion ripped through the station, obliterating everything in its path. The black growths disintegrated, the entity's hold shattered in an instant. The force of the blast consumed us, our bodies vaporized in the inferno. As the station was consumed by the explosion, the entity's final taunt echoed in the void. "You cannot destroy me!" But we had done it. We had ensured that the entity would not escape, that it would not spread its darkness beyond the confines of Epsilon-12. In our final act, we had saved countless lives, even if it meant sacrificing our own. The remains of the station drifted through the cold expanse of space, a silent testament to our final stand. The entity was gone, its threat extinguished, and the nightmare ended in a flash of light and heat. The station was destroyed, the entity with it, and the void reclaimed the silence once more.